And 4 tonight, taking risks and eradicating or including. And that's people, whether you're keeping them in your group or you're pushing them out. So we begin with taking risks, and the key scripture here is Matthew 14, verses 29 through 30, which read, "He said, 'Come.' So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me.'" And that's where we begin. Everything is risky. Everything requires a certain level of risk, like conducting this class online. That can be risky business. So, to overcome politics, for instance, enough to be able to talk to each other, to cross over divides between us, that can be risky. And it involves being willing to take risks in a long and often challenging process. I'll apologize, I'm going to be coughing a little tonight. I've gotten over an illness, but I have some residual cough, and that's going to be an issue throughout the evening. I apologize for that. So, the story of Peter and Jesus, where Peter is offered to come out and walk on the water. That's from Matthew that we read. That deals with dealing with risk in our faith journey. Peter is distracted by the storm. He takes his eyes off Jesus, and when he does that, when he becomes distracted from his goal, he begins to sink. Today, opposing viewpoints act like those same storms. They distract us from the bigger picture. We end up being fixated on points on which we disagree, and we stop seeing the other person as a human being, and instead we see them as, in some way, as other. And when we do that, we have lost the big picture and become fixated on some aspect of the storm. God calls us to focus on Jesus, and then to learn to take a broader view and to love people where they are in the world today. This doesn't mean that we can't encourage people to have a change of perspective, particularly if they've got some perspective that is warping and damaging their lives. We certainly can encourage people to pick up issues of justice and peace and love in the world, which is always a positive thing. It also means that we take a broader view of ourselves and of others. When we're in dialogue with each other, we might actually change our perspectives as well. We should go into conversations with the idea that my mind might be changed. My perspective might be changed by the other person's point of view. And that's a good way to approach any given conversation. Churches should be creating opportunities for dialogue. That is a wonderful thing to do, and that's a positive view of what the church can be and how the church can facilitate, in an age where people are increasingly divided, opportunities to build bridges instead of chasms. And it runs counter to the idea that some people have of what they call spaceship church, where everybody bundles into the church and they don't worry about the world around them. They just wait to fly off to heaven. And that's a really dangerous point of view, because it just leaves people to their own devices who are outside of a very small group. And that's not very useful, and it's not what Jesus calls us to do. We need to be reconciling people in the face of division. And that's how Christians are meant to navigate in the world. To be in the world, but not to be of the world, as Romans 12:2 tells us. Before we begin the journey of reconciliation, we have to be recognizing that there's a risk in this first step. Modern minds have trouble with miracles. Let's talk about post-resurrection Jesus and the idea of miracles. I worked with a professor, actually I studied with a professor who wrote a 2,000-page book on modern miracles, and he tracked them down worldwide. God doesn't worry about the physical laws of the universe. God created everything. And so God can work outside of those laws. Easter symbolizes God's power over death with the resurrection of Jesus, and therefore God overcomes chaos. Death was considered a form of chaos. The ancient seas of the world symbolized chaos as well. The sea was seen as evoking death in its wildness, in its untamability. So walking on the water, as Jesus did and Peter tried, symbolizes conquering death. And so you see how deep the symbolism of the Bible goes, how complex the stories become. Jesus walking on the water speaks to Jesus' authority, Jesus' authority over all aspects of life and of death as well. And so Jesus invites Peter out onto the water, out to do something risky, something that could be deadly. Jesus hasn't conquered death yet when he invites Peter out, so this is seen as quite the risk. And living in the age that we live in, we see the tumult around us as waves and storms, and so we seek safety from it. We try to avoid risk, even when Jesus calls to us and asks us to take risks. We have a tendency to want to stay safe, tucked away in the boat, whereas Jesus calls humanity to join together in the midst of life's storms, to move together as a people. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 1 through 6 reads, "I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of the call to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is only one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all." It's a call to unity for all of us. And the Bible repeatedly calls us to unity. It's done regularly throughout Scripture. Jesus appears and challenges us, provoking us to move beyond our comfort zones. And Jesus is frightening to us sometimes when he does this. Whatever the risk we're facing, though, we need to realize that God is there with us. God's presence mediated by Jesus, and Jesus is present in the community of faith. We have that promise from Jesus, whether 2 or 3 of you are gathered, I am there. So that is something that we can live by. I'm getting some issues here, but we're going to continue. We're going to move on despite that. We're going to continue in our stream. We're going to be persistent. And whatever risks we face, so with polarization and the politics in the U.S. that we have today, this might seem like a new thing. This is a scary, divisive, new thing, but it's not. Nor is it new to the history of humanity, the history of civilization. And still, despite all that, God keeps moving forward. God keeps bending us towards the way of love and justice and mercy and peace, and asks us to move along with him and to work for those things as well. The author argues that Peter's leap was not just getting out of the boat, but leaving his community behind. Peter represents the disciples, and the boat is the community of faith. That's an interesting way to see this. Peter leaves his community. When he heads out alone, he sees the violence of the storm and he panics, not having the support of others around him, and he begins to sink. Sometimes, when we're taking a risk for God, we need the community of the faithful with us so that we can move forward together. And that is a wonderful way to try to build unity amongst people. The real risk is not stepping out of the boat. The real risk is leaving community. Jesus takes Peter's hand, leads him back to the community of the disciples, and whatever risks God calls us to take, and the answer to that, what we're being called to do, that's going to be unique to each person and to each church. The individual call doesn't mean that we leave our community behind to answer it. We remain a part of the faith community together in our churches, in community with other people, and the churches are the people after all. And while we're listening to what God is saying to us, we bring others with us when we do it. And to do that, we have to overcome our differences, the polarization and the political extremes that are dividing us. And to do that, we have to take risks. We have to risk seeming to be isolated from others. We have to risk these strong differences of opinions that are happening all around us. We have to respond to these closely held beliefs and the emotional responses to them. We have to ask ourselves, can we face these risks because God is with us? And the answer to that is yes, we can. God doesn't send us out alone. God is with us wherever we go. God is with us in the boat of Christian fellowship, and He's walking alongside us when we seek unity with other people. Now, okay, that's all working properly according to this. Fred Rogers, we now head into chapter 4, whether or not we're going to eradicate or include. And Fred Rogers says, knowing that we can be loved exactly as we are gives us all the best opportunity to grow into the healthiest of people. People get to decide whether they're going to be inclusive or exclusive in the world today. In these stark political climates of the 21st century in America, where I'm speaking to you from, we ascribe a lot of identities to other people. We start to think of someone as part of our own tribe and therefore good, or part of another tribe and therefore suspicious or bad. And that way of thinking has to come to an end. That's a very primitive way of looking at the world. We also have to watch out for an either-or approach that paints people as either for us or against us. Constructive relationships with other people who feel differently about an issue or who look differently can seem to be challenging at times, but it is possible. We have to be civil one with another. We have to choose our words carefully. How we describe other people. We want to avoid any situation that will lead to violence. We don't want to speak of another group in some aggressive way that encourages some people to respond to that other group violently. That's wrong. That is something we need to avoid. For example, let's say you want to eradicate terrorists. So how do you do that? Well, it's not, you don't destroy the people. What you do is you have to root out the causes of terrorism. And the causes of terrorism are poverty and inequality and cultural shifts that groups of people are not prepared for. And if you deal with those, you can stop having people led towards religious fanaticism and away from terrorism. When you address poverty and inequality and those cultural shifts, and you bring people into the cultural fold, and you give them the tools that they need to adjust, then the religious fanatics have trouble recruiting new terrorists. Also, to fight terrorism, you need to develop partnerships with other countries, other groups that are also engaged in this kind of resistance to terrorism. You develop regional partnerships, and this becomes far more effective than drones and bombs. It's a wonderful way to proceed. Third, you have to eliminate fear, because fear is the currency of terrorism. We must not be afraid. The Bible tells us that over and over again. We need to eliminate fear. And in these ways, we rise above terrorism. And the Bible assures us that God is in control. And if Christians believe that, then we have nothing to fear in this world. And it will help us to face polarization. It will help us to face the divisions within our country and within our world, understanding and believing, having faith that God is with us. And when we prayerfully seek ways to reconcile our differences, God is indeed with us. We seek including other people and speaking out against inflammatory rhetoric, like eradicating other people completely. Words matter. So let's engage thoughtfully in discourse one with another about complicated problems and avoid vacuous platitudes, avoid inflammatory language, avoid creating situations where other people are less than human, because all of those things generate fear. And that's something we need to avoid. We need to be very cautious about the way we speak and what we choose to say to others and what we choose to believe. All right. We're coming to the end of our half hour. I'm sorry for the raggedy start here. It has been an interesting evening. We will do this again next week, and with any luck, things will go well, and we'll have more attendance. So until then, I wish you all the best. God bless you, and I will see you again next week.